One comment here before getting into the sermon. I couldn't help but notice that in the latest issue of U.S. News and World Report, they have written a book on the Gulf War. Of course, we're just at the one-year anniversary. Focus the last few days was on the beginning of the Gulf War a year ago. They've written a book on the subject, and it's interesting. The title that they chose is called Triumph Without Victory. Triumph Without Victory. Because in retrospect, the analysis has been more and more that while we certainly possess the power to go in and completely destroy it, and we showed that on the other hand, we were ill-defined in terms of what our objectives were, and so here we are a year later, and we find that Saddam Hussein is, of course, still in power, and perhaps has about as firm a lock on his power as President Bush does on his presidency. So we triumphed, but were we really victorious? Sort of an interesting point that we can reflect on in retrospect, because many times when events transpire, and in the midst of those events, it's very difficult to get a perspective on it and to realize what is going to be the long-term consequence and what is really going to be the effect. And so we see that while there were certain things that were accomplished of an immediate nature, that on the other hand, did it really solve the problems in the Middle East? So, well, I think we all know the answer to that, and it has set the stage for a number of things. And one of the things to realize, and just to keep note on, the Bible shows that in the book of Daniel shows that the two great power blocks that are going to be focused, the focus of world attention at the beginning of the tribulation, or prior to the onset of the tribulation, what are going to appear, two great power blocks, are what are termed the King of the North and the King of the South. These are the ones that are preeminent on the world scene in terms of world power blocks that are facing off against one another. And, of course, the King of the North will eliminate the King of the South, which will initiate the tribulation. And then there will, in the aftermath later of that, emerge a grouping of what are called the kings of the East, not just one great superpower, but a collection of various ones. But, it's interesting what is shaping up, because the North, King of the North, refers to Catholic-dominated Europe. The South refers to the Islamic world, which we find, of course, in the Middle East and North Africa, and sweeping across in that way. Sort of that block of what is north and south of the Mediterranean, as you could view it, with, of course, Israel, Jerusalem being sort of in the middle. And the things that we're seeing, that increasingly the resurgence of fundamentalism in the Islamic world, the fear that Algeria is going to gain a very strict fundamentalist Islamic government, which of course prompted the cancellation of elections there. A number of things to watch in that regard, because as the Soviet Union has disappeared from the world scene, we see shaping up other things, and make some comment a little later or at another time on some of that, just to kind of call your attention to it, and to gain a little bit of perspective in terms of what actually happened a year ago. The realization that we triumphed militarily, but did we really win in the full sense of being victorious? Well, almost 50 years ago, of course, World War II was over, and in the aftermath of World War II, one of the things that there came to be an increasing emphasis on in the United States and in American industry was an emphasis on management. Now, back at an earlier time, around the time of World War I and sort of in the aftermath of that, there was an emphasis on efficiency. But in the aftermath of World War II, there came to be more of an emphasis on management skills. There have been studies, there have been entire businesses that have been devoted to management techniques. And of course, in recent years, there has been a lot of emphasis on various management styles. We've talked about, if you've read or listened on the news to any of it, to talk about the so-called Japanese management style contrasted with the American approach. There are all sorts of books that have been written, training seminars. There are people who've made their living at teaching others how to be effective managers. Now, what many times people have not realized, and sometimes maybe some of us have not realized, is that really the entire Christian life can be viewed, can be looked at as a management training program. Now, maybe you haven't thought of the Christian life as a management training program, but the Christian life is a management training program for the world tomorrow. Because God right now is training us to manage, to carry out responsible positions in His government. We look around and we see what's happening in the governments of this world today. We look at the chaos, we look at the confusion, we look at the warfare, we look at the strife, we look at the poverty, we look at the disparities and the injustices that exist. We look at the circumstance that whether it's the Middle East, whether it is any area of the world, and it's very apparent that this world is moving toward a collision course. This world is moving toward a collision course of the various power blocks and entities that comprise it. And certainly we see these things shaping up. But that's not the end of the story. The elimination of this country and the deportation of much of our population into the concentration camps of the future, the preemptive attack and assault that the King of the North, that Europe will launch against the Islamic world, against the King of the South, the problems that are going to ensue and the later retaliations, the suspicions and eventual retaliations that will be planned by the powers of Asia. Those things do not represent the total end of the story and annihilation of mankind, because what we're told is that those days will be cut short and the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never come to an end. Now, who's going to possess that kingdom that the God of heaven sets up? We're told that the saints of the Most High will possess the kingdom, even forever and ever. The saints of the Most High, that's you and that's me. And we need to understand the reality that we're talking about a few years from now. We're talking about our future. And yet God is in the process of preparing us for that future right here, right now. I would like for us to focus and to understand a little bit of what God is teaching us concerning the principles of proper management. God is preparing us to rule and to reign under Jesus Christ. We're going to have managerial responsibilities for various aspects of the government of God. It may be for educational aspects. Maybe we're going to be dealing with certain phases of education. Maybe we're going to be dealing with certain administrative duties in certain areas. Maybe in a city, on a city level, or a state, or a national level. We're going responsibilities and oversight and management in all spheres, whether it has to do in areas dealing with education or with commerce or with agriculture or with religion or with any of the various phases of life. God's government is going to be organized. And there are going to be many phases of it dealing with every aspect of human life. Because there's going to be a literal government, and Jesus Christ is going to be sitting on a literal throne in Jerusalem, surrounded there by men like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They're going to be literal thrones occupied by men like King David, ruling over all of the nations of Israel. The 12 apostles, we're told, each one will sit on a specific throne over one of the tribes. You know, one of the apostles will be sitting located in this country. Now, where that's going to be, where the capital is going to be, whether it'll be in the vicinity of Washington, D.C., or some totally different location, we don't know that. But you know, one of the apostles is going to be in charge of that. Who will it be? Well, I don't know. You know, be Andrew or James or Peter or John or various ones. I'm sure it would undoubtedly be one of as Manasseh will certainly be one of the leading most nations, right under part of Israel, right under Manasseh. I'm sure it'll be one of probably that inner group of apostles. But nevertheless, there are going to be various ones then to assist them in various areas, and God's government will encompass this nation, will encompass all the nations of the world. And we are going to be fulfilling some of those aspects. They're going to be the whole gamut of education, of agriculture, of commerce and industry, all aspects of life. And they're going to be managerial responsibilities. Now, God is in the process of preparing us for that right now. And let's understand some of that and how it is going to carry over into what we're going to be doing in a few years. You know, when God put man upon the earth, man was put here to manage, to exercise rulership, to exercise managerial responsibility. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion. Let them have rulership. Let them be responsible for managing and ruling over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." God placed man upon the earth to have dominion. He told them to, in verse 28, to be fruitful, to multiply, to replenish the earth, to subdue it, and to have dominion. So mankind was to subdue, to bring under himself this earth, to exercise dominion, to exercise lordship or rulership, responsibility over this earth. And yet, there is an accountability to God. How has man exercised that dominion? Mankind has been given that at the time of creation. God said He put man on the earth to have dominion over the earth. How has man exercised that dominion? Sort of an interesting statement that is made in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18, talking about the time of the return of Jesus Christ. In Revelation 11:18, we're told the response when Christ returns. It says, "The nations were angry, and your wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should give reward unto your servants the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear your name, small and great, and should destroy them which destroy the earth," or destroy them which corrupt the earth. Now, man was placed on the earth to exercise rulership, to exercise dominion, and yet Jesus Christ, when He returns, He is going to deal with those who destroy the earth, who corrupt the earth. So mankind was placed here to have dominion, to subdue it, to have dominion, and yet we're told here that one of the problems is that man has corrupted and is in the process of destroying the earth. And there's going to be a time of reckoning coming. So God is not pleased with the way that mankind as a whole has exercised His lordship, His dominion, His responsibility, His managerial responsibilities. God is not pleased with the way that mankind has managed His responsibilities. We're told that in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 22, that except those days should be shortened. There should no flesh be saved, no flesh be left alive. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. So man's rulership, man's dominion is such that if God did not step in at the point when He will, there would not be anything left. Man would annihilate life off of the planet if God did not step in at the time that He will. So what we clearly see is that man has failed to properly manage what God has given. Man has not been a success as a manager of this earth. Now, Christ is not going to have the same thing in the world tomorrow. Now, let's understand a little bit of why it's important. I say this is a management training program that we're on. Matthew chapter 25, we're given a little understanding, a little insight into that. Matthew 25:14. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country. He called his own servants, and he delivered to them his goods. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to every man according to his several ability, and straightway he took his journey. Now he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and he made another 5, doubled his money. Likewise, he that received the 2, he went, and he gained 2 more. He that had received the 1 went and dug a hole in the earth and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and reckoned with them. And so he that had received the 5 came, and he brought the other 5, and he said, Lord, you gave me 5 talents. I have gained beside them 5 more. And he said, well done, you good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter you into the joy of your Lord. He also that had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, you delivered unto me 2. Behold, I've gained another 2. His Lord said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I'll make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Then he that had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I was afraid. I knew you're a hard man. You reap where you haven't sown and gather where you haven't strawed. You expect an awful lot. And I knew that, and I was afraid. I figured I'm liable to mess up with the one you gave me, so I went and hid it in the ground. Here it is. I'm giving it back to you. The Lord said, you wicked and lazy servant, you slothful servant, you knew. You say that I demand a lot, and you didn't even provide anything. You showed no increase. You could have at least put my money to the exchangers. You could have at least put it in the bank and gotten interest on it. And then I would have received my own with usury, with interest. Take therefore the talent from him and give it to the one that has 10. Unto every one that has shall be given, and he that shall have abundance. But to him that has not shall be taken away even that which he has. So we're told here in verse 31, when the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations. And he'll separate them out, begin the process of separating out sheep from goats. And the king will say in verse 34 to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. We're looking at the establishment of the government of God. Well, what are we told? Christ gave a parable. And this parable, this illustration was a comparison. He said a young ruler left, and he went into a far country. And he left his servants responsible with his goods. And when he came back, he demanded an accounting. What did you do with what you had? Now, there is a principle, we're told, to him that overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my throne. To him that overcomes. What we have right here, talents. Of course, talent was a Roman reckoning of money. And we have an illustration of somebody being given money the master's property and told to be responsible with it, to manage it in his absence. And we're given the principle that if we've been faithful with little, we will be given rulership over much. So right now, what we're going through in the Christian life is a management training program because we have responsibility. We are given a chance to manage on a small scale. We're given a chance to manage on a small scale. And the way that we carry out that responsibility is going to determine what we get on a large scale. Now let's look at something that is right at the heart and core of management, being a good manager, and that is trust. You know, if you go back to Genesis 15, verse 2, you read of Abraham's servant, Eliezer of Damascus, who was the steward over all of Abraham's house, or the manager over all of Abraham's affairs. At a later time, Abraham entrusted him with to go back and to get a wife for Isaac. And if you go through the story, you read that he went back to Ur of the Chaldees. He went back with camels loaded down with gifts and with various things to demonstrate the prosperity of Abraham and the fact that that Rebekah would be well taken care of if she came there. Now, Abraham wasn't worried the fact that Eliezer of Damascus was going to light out for Egypt with all this stuff, and he'd never find him again. He had a lot of trust in this servant. This was the servant, we're told, that he had set over all of his house. You know, one of the most important things has to do with being trusted. You see, how are we being trained as managers? Well, one of the most crucial things has to do with the area of trust. Just look at Luke 16. Here we have the story of the unjust steward. The unjust steward, or the unjust manager. We're told in verse 1, he said, there was a certain rich man that had a steward. And rumor came to him, this fellow had wasted his goods. You know, this was the original SNL scandal. This guy had, there's nothing new under the sun, you know. Whether you call it an SNL or whatever you call it, the point is there have always been people who have been responsible for other people's money that haven't taken good care of it. They used it to enrich themselves and not to be faithful, not to be trustworthy. Well, word got to this fellow that his manager, his steward, was a crook. Had wasted his goods, and he called him and he said, "What is this I hear of you? Give an account of your stewardship. You may no longer be steward. You know, I may fire you. I want an audit. I'm going to have the books audited. And I want you to give an account for what you've done." Well, the steward said to himself, "What am I going to do? All he's got to do is audit the books and I'm going to be fired." You know, I know when he looks, because the steward knew he was a crook, see, so he says, "Boy, I'm in trouble now. What am I going to do? He's going to take away my stewardship. I can't dig. You know, I've had this soft job for all these years. I can't go out and get a job manual labor digging a ditch. Well, I'm not up to that anymore. I've had sort of this soft, cushy job I've laid around for years. I can't do that. I'm ashamed to beg. Don't want to do that either. I've got to figure out something because I know that the jig is up. All he's going to have to do is look at the books and I'm fired." So then he says, "I know what I'm going to do when I'm put out of my stewardship, that there are those that I'm going to have obligated to me that I'm going to be able to get something out of." So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him and said, "How much do you owe my Lord?" And he said, "Well, 100 measures of oil." He said, "Here, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. So he falsified the accounts. And he said, I'm going to fix it up where these guys in collusion, that I'm going to let them off, and then this is going to be my retirement plan. See, I'm going to fix up this deal with these guys, these creditors here, before the books are audited. Before I'm fired, I've got a day or so, and I'm going to fix this thing up to where I am covered. I'm going to falsify these accounts, falsify bills, rewrite old bills for different amounts, and then they're going to be indebted to me, because if the truth comes out, I'll go to jail, and so will they. So I'm going to fix this thing up so that they will receive me into their house. In other words, they'll take care of me. So he did. And we're told in verse 8, the Lord commended the unjust steward because he'd done wisely. Now, he didn't commend him for being a crook. He just admitted, he says, this guy outsmarted me. I know he's a crook, but I can't prove it. I know what he did. In his own mind, he knew it. He couldn't prove it. And he said, I got to hand it to this guy. He's smarter than me. He outsmarted me. He really rooked me. The children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Now, the point is, here you had a man that was a steward. He was a manager, but he was a crook. He was not trustworthy. He was a complete contrast to Eliezer of Damascus, Abraham's steward. You see, trust is at the core of requirements for stewardship. And when God is preparing us to have rulership in the world tomorrow, one of the greatest things and one of the most important aspects of our training and preparation here and now involves the area of trust. Can God trust us to faithfully carry out His government? Can God faithfully trust us? Can He trust us to be faithful in our responsibilities, whatever He assigns us? You see, that is one of the things that we demonstrate to God right now. There are some people who take an attitude that they want to go as far as they can go. They want to see how much they can get by with. And the more, Mr. Rice talked about freedom in the sermonette. And, of course, it's not always just limited to young people, because people of any age can abuse freedom. As you go through the story in the Scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, we find that God's government has been administered down through the generations, and we find that there have been times when God's government was administered very, very strictly. You might take note of the time of Nehemiah, for instance. We could find other times, perhaps during the time of Eli or Samson, when God's government was administered in a very lax way. Now, the point was, individuals, the same test was there. To what extent could they be trusted to look to God? It was a matter of how they handled the strictness or how they handled the laxity. There were some who, if they were given an inch, they took a mile. There were others who chafed under any restrictions and were not trustworthy in terms of carrying it out. So, God is interested in the extent to which we can be trusted. Do we really want to be like Him? Is our heart in the world, and if we get an opportunity, if we get an inch, we're going to try and take a mile? Is our heart in the world that we want to go to whatever extreme and to go as far as we can? Or is our heart in God's kingdom and in God's way, and we want to be like Him? God wants to know to what extent we can be trusted. We build spiritual character by doing physical things, because ultimately everything we do is physical. And it has a physical component because we are. You get down on your knees and pray, that involves some physical effort. But we build spiritual character by the way that we do physical things. We all have things to manage. Everybody has certain things. We all have talent. We all have time. You know, that's something. Every human being has time. And in any given day, we have the same amount of that time. We have 24 hours. We have the same amount of time in a day that Jesus Christ had in a day when He was on the earth, that the Apostle Peter or the Apostle Paul had. Well, same amount of time in a day that Mr. DeKotch has. Same amount of time in a day. Everybody has the same amount of time in a 24-hour day. Now, Ephesians chapter 5, in verse 15, says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, walk carefully, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." Realize we live in troubled times. We live in difficult times. We live in evil times. And we need to redeem the time. We need to make best use of the time we have, walking through life carefully, not foolishly, wasting the time that we have, but making good use of it. You know, God said in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 6, He says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, gathers her food in the summer and prepares her food in the harvest." Now, we're told we can learn something from the ant. And the issue there has to do with what the ant does with its time. Now, the ant doesn't sit down and think about it and work out a schedule. The ant just sort of does what it's programmed to do. But God figures that we have a mind, and we certainly ought to be able to be as smart as an ant. You know, an ant doesn't have a very big little brain. You make a pencil dot, and you've just about summed up an ant's brain. Now, if an ant can do what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it, and all it's got is a little old brain about the size of a pencil dot, then with the mind that God's given us, we certainly ought to be able to figure out what an ant does, and to do it at least as well. Time is one thing that we all have to manage. It is an opportunity. You see, management is important. We're given an opportunity to manage on a small scale, and ultimately we'll be rewarded on a large scale. Trust is at the heart and core of what we are developing. We build spiritual character by doing physical things, and we all have things to manage. We have our time. Are we managing our time wisely? You know, if we can't find time to pray and to study, we're not managing our time wisely. That's not a wise allocation of that valuable resource. We're not spending time with God. If if we're not using our time in a constructive way, and we have various responsibilities, and the responsibilities we have can vary at different times in our life. Responsibilities, for instance, is someone who is maybe a young wife and mother and has several children at home and a husband. Those responsibilities are one thing, and at a different stage in life, maybe after the children are grown and gone or something of that sort, the kinds of responsibilities vary. The same with a man. But it's a matter of making wise use of the time we have when we have it and when we're in that circumstance. We all have time. And that's something we have a chance to learn to manage. We all have various resources. You know, Genesis 1:26, we said, God said, you know, have rulership over the earth and over all of the creatures. You know, that's a good point in terms of teaching a small child. When you begin to teach a little child how to be a good manager, how to take care of what he has. Now, maybe what he has rulership over may be his puppy or his kitten. And he has to learn to be a responsible steward, seeing that, you know, the animal has food and water, or of maybe he has responsibility, you know, has rulership over his toy box to see that it's all picked up and put in. You know, it may be on a very small scale, but the principles of character that are learned of being responsible over whatever resources we have, learning to manage those resources. We all have various talents in the sense of abilities. God lays great emphasis on developing and honing those abilities, on gaining understanding or education, which can be in the moral sphere as well as in the physical sphere. He talks about the value of gaining knowledge and understanding. In Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 2, he says, apply your ear unto wisdom. Apply your heart to understanding. If you cry after knowledge, lift up your voice for understanding. Seek her as silver, search for her as for hid treasures. Then you'll understand the fear of the Lord and the knowledge of God. The Lord gives wisdom, and out of His mouth comes knowledge and understanding. So God talks about the importance of applying our heart to understanding, of seeking knowledge and understanding, of developing our talents and abilities, of growing in knowledge and understanding. That's important. Certainly it's important in the moral sphere, important in every aspect of life, and it's certainly important even in developing skills and abilities and talents that we have in the area of being able to provide a livelihood, as certainly as a man to develop his talents and his skills to where he's able to meet the responsibilities he has for a family. God says we ought to value education, value knowledge and understanding. This is in every facet of our life. It certainly begins with a knowledge of God and an understanding of His ways, but it can carry through to every other aspect of our life. Now, our talents can be in different areas. Our talents may be in mechanical areas. They may be in various academic areas. They can be in a wide variety of areas. We don't all have to go down the same, go in exactly the same path when it comes to the kind of education that we pursue. But we all ought to pursue the development of the talents and the abilities that we have. That's being a wise manager of the resources that we have, the talents and the abilities that we have, making good use of them, developing. So, whatever we're going to be, if you're going to be an electrician, or if you're going to be a teacher, or if you're going to be a businessman, or if you're going to be a mechanic, or whatever you're going to be, that you develop your talents, that you pursue knowledge and understanding to develop and to be the best that you're capable of being in that area. We have a variety of interests, and there are a whole variety of things that are profitable and that are useful. But whatever our area of endeavor, we ought to seek to develop ourselves to pursue knowledge and understanding in that area, so that we increase in our value and in our ability, that we show ourselves as a good steward of that particular talent, that particular ability. We can learn in managing our resources, managing our money. It's a good place to learn stewardship. A lot of times stewardship is equated with tithing in the minds of some people. Well, that certainly is an important part of being a good steward, because if you steal from God, then you sort of miss you're in trouble before you ever get going. That's the height of being a bad steward. You're stealing from the boss. You're stealing from the one that owns everything. But that's not all there is to being a good steward. It can certainly make you a bad steward, but it's not going to. There's more to it. We want to learn to be wise managers, to be careful managers, and certainly to honor God with the first fruits of our increase. That's a starting point to being a good manager, a good steward of whatever money God has given us. We're told in Proverbs 13:23, much food is in the tillage of the poor, but there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. There are a lot of times there's things that are wasted because of poor judgment, because of a lack of careful management. There are many times people who have had a lot of things that have sort of come through their hands, but it's rotted, it's wasted, it's decayed. It hasn't been properly taken care of. And as a result, when they need it, they don't have it. So, we have opportunity of developing the aspects of being a good manager with our time, with all sorts of resources, with our talents and abilities, with our money. Now let's look at some specific things of being a good manager. 4 specific things that are required of every good manager. Every good manager has got to be these 4 things, and these are attributes that we can develop in our time and in our resources and our abilities and talents and our money in managing and controlling these things. Here are attributes that we can develop. First, most important attribute of every good manager is you've got to be faithful to your trust. You know, the worst thing you can have, the worst quality of a manager, is that he's a crook. He's dishonest. If you're going to hire somebody, I don't think any of us have so much money and property that we've got to hire somebody to manage it for us. I don't think that's a major problem that any of us have. I don't have it. Don't think any of you have it. But, there are people who are that way, and that's great. If I were in that situation, or you were in that situation, the last thing that we'd look for would be somebody who was a crook, who was dishonest. The guy that just, it is sort of incredible because, some of these people that wind up getting in trouble and in one area, they wind up going to something else. They get hired into the government or something. Sort of like sort of like back years ago, Bert Lance, who was head of an S&L in Georgia and got in trouble and was accused of improprieties, and the thing went bankrupt and all sorts of problems. So he was hired as director of the Office of Management and Budget for the whole United States of America. And I always thought that was sort of ironic that the guy that went bust in his business said, well, look, since maybe you can't blame it all on him in terms of the problems the country is in, but it just always struck me as ironic because that's not really what we look for. We're told that what Christ is going to look for in Luke 12:42. The Lord said, "Who then is that faithful and wise steward, whom his Lord shall make ruler over his household and give them their portion of meat in due season?" Who is that faithful steward? Who is Christ going to make ruler over his household? Well, first thing he's going to look for is a faithful steward. A faithful steward. Somebody who's honest, who can be trusted to do what he's supposed to do. 1 Corinthians 4:2. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1, Paul says, "Let a man so account of us as of the ministers of Christ, stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it's required in stewards that a man be found faithful." First thing required of a steward is he's got to be honest. He's got to be faithful. The primary characteristic of being a good steward, of being a good manager that God is developing in us right now is that quality of faithfulness. That's essential if we're going to be a good manager, be a good steward. And we show faithfulness in all areas of our life. Every area where we have responsibility. It can be in our home, it can be in our finances, it can be on the job, it can be in all areas that we are developing the characteristic of faithfulness. That God can trust us to administer His government the very best that we're able to do. So God is looking for faithfulness. The second characteristic of being a good manager, we saw it right here in Proverbs chapter 12, or in Luke chapter 12, the verse that we just read, Luke 12:42. The Lord said, "Who then is that faithful and wise steward, whom his Lord shall make ruler over his household and give them their portion of meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find so doing." So not only, first thing God's looking for is a faithful steward. A second quality that we have to develop if we're going to be preparing as stewards, as managers, if we're using our Christian life as a manager training program, is we're developing faithfulness, we need to develop wisdom. But they're not taking care of them either. Well, you wouldn't want that guy either. First thing is you want him to be honest. Second thing is you want him to be competent, to be wise. You were hiring somebody, you'd want him to be diligent. He would be diligent to know the state of the flocks. He'd be keeping up with them, and whether they were sick or healthy, and whether they needed to be moved from one pasture to another, or whether they needed the water was sufficient, or whether they needed protection, or whether some of them got lost. He'd be keeping up with them, and watching them and making sure that every precaution was taken. Well, that is an aspect of being a good manager. We want to learn faithfulness. We want to learn wisdom. And this is a principle that we can apply in every aspect of our lives. You don't have to be a shepherd to apply the principle of being diligent to know the state of your flocks and look well to your herds. Whatever you have rulership over is your flocks. If you're if you're a salesman, it could be your customers and the items that you are selling. If whatever area of endeavor, it could apply to the things that are a part of your trade, a part of your business, the things that you're going to have to keep up with. There's a principle here. It can carry over into our families. It can carry over into every state of our affairs. To be diligent to keep up with what we have. To look well to our herds. Be thinking ahead. Be planning. Developing wisdom. Of trying to be a wise steward. A faithful steward and a wise steward. Now let's notice another quality. Of being a good steward is that of being blameless in conduct. Not conducting ourselves in a way that, if a manager, a steward, his conduct is a reflection on his employer. And certainly, particularly in years past, many employers recognized this, and many of them had very strict requirements, very strict regulations for those that worked under them in various capacities. IBM was quite well known for having a lot of regulations that applied to their sales force and their management, their people in management, because they viewed it that the conduct of their managers was going to be a reflection on the image of the company. And that's certainly the case as far as God is concerned. He wants His managers, His stewards, to be blameless in their conduct so that they are ready, so that they are a proper reflection, good reflection. We're told in Titus chapter 1, in verse 7, speaking here of ordaining to the ministry, he says, "For a bishop, an overseer, must be blameless as the steward of God." And then it goes through and shows what it means to be blameless. Not self-willed, not soon angry, not given to wine, no striker, not given to filthy lucre, but a lover of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, temperate, holding fast the faithful word as he's been taught. So, he must be blameless as the steward of God. His conduct must be above reproach because he's there as God's steward. Now, this is an important aspect of stewardship, is being above reproach. Realizing that if we're God's stewards, if we're going to be ruling and reigning under Jesus Christ in the world tomorrow, that's why God is concerned about what we do in our own personal lives here and now. When a government official or when somebody gets in trouble in his own personal life, it carries over. It is a reflection. That's why that a lot of times a scandal will drive a man from office, because his conduct is such that it is considered that it tarnishes the office and renders him unworthy to hold that position. And we've seen that has been the case over the years, the realization that conduct, that example, was important. Somebody is going to hold a position of trust. So, if we're going to be a good manager, and those that Jesus Christ is going to have under him are going to be that way, they're going to have to be faithful. They're going to have to be wise and blameless. We're having the opportunity of developing in our lives faithfulness and wisdom and blameless conduct, being wholehearted in what we're doing, trying to grow and to overcome, realizing that it's a matter of what we do with what we have. God does not expect from us what we don't have. He does not judge us on the basis of what opportunities others had. He judges us on the basis of what we've done with the opportunities we've had. Our circumstances are different. And God looks at what we've done with what we've had to do with. One other characteristic, a fourth characteristic, is that managers are accountable. They are accountable. They must always be ready to give an account. You see, a manager is managing, controlling what really belongs to somebody else. Every manager is accountable to someone. Whether it be a board of directors or whether it be an individual. Every manager is accountable to someone. And there is an accountability. We can't just go off and do our own thing. We have to realize that if we're going to be faithful managers, if we're going to be a good manager, we have to be ready to be accountable. We have to recognize that responsibility and that accountability. Luke chapter 16, verse 2, we read that, the unprofitable or the unjust steward. And what was he told? He was said, look, come and give an account of your stewardship. One of the requirements of being a steward is you've got to be ready when called upon to give an account. Open up the books and say, here it is. This is what I've done. See, a lot of times people think, well, who do I have to give an account to? In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 9, he's talking here to masters, or in our modern sense, it would be employers. He says, you masters, you employers, do the same thing unto them, speaking of your servants or your employees, forbearing threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven. Neither shall there be any respect of persons with him. Now, what's the point God makes here through the Apostle Paul? He says, you that are masters, you that have other people at your beck and call, you that have control or rulership over others as your employers, as your employees, as your servants, one thing to keep in mind, you also have a master. You are accountable to somebody for the way you treat these under you. You don't just have the freedom to, I'll just treat them any way I want to. I don't have to answer to anybody. Oh, yes, we all have to answer. We all have to answer. And, ultimately we all answer even on a human level. But if you escape answering on a human level, we certainly answer on the level of answering to God Himself. So, there's an accountability here that involves someone who's an employer, who's a master. He's accountable. It says the same principle is brought out in Colossians 4:1. It says, masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Understand that you're accountable. You have somebody that's over you, and so you deal with those under you the way you wish to be dealt with. Deal with them fairly. Don't take advantage of your position of power to take advantage of them or to do something to their detriment. You deal with them the way you would wish to be dealt with in a similar circumstance. Because realize you've got somebody that you are accountable to. You're going to have to give answer as to what kind of boss you were. What about employees? What about those who work under somebody? Well, there's an accountability there too. Colossians 3:22 says, "Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. Whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord you shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Jesus Christ. And he that does wrong shall receive for the wrong which he has done, and there's no respect of persons." So if you're a boss, if you're a master, an employer, you're accountable. You're the steward of God, and you're accountable to God for the way that you deal with those under you. If you're a servant, if you're an employee, you're accountable to God also. You're accountable to God for the way that you serve the man that you're under. It doesn't matter if he sees it or not. It says not with eye service as men pleasers. There are a lot of people, the boss comes around, boy, they get real productive and they start doing all this stuff. As soon as the boss goes, they kind of fall back, start talking or start doing whatever they were doing before. Christ says, look, God's watching all the time. Boss may just kind of come and go. A lot of things you can do, he'll never find out. But if you're working for somebody, don't serve them just with eye service. Don't just try and impress them, but work for them as though you were working directly for God. Do it heartily as unto the Lord, not unto man. Because God's taking note. And ultimately that determines a part of our reward. Because you see, we build spiritual character by doing physical things. And if we're working for somebody, we need to be doing the best that we can do. And realize if they're not doing what they ought to do, God will deal with them. And if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, God will deal with me. See, sometimes we want to take it out. Well, I don't think this guy's a crook, and I don't think he's paying me what I'm worth, and so I'm just going to give him about a halfway job. I'm going to get even with him. Kind of take out the rest in tools or something. Take home. There was a joke about the old guy that for years they suspected him of stealing from the construction site, never could figure out what he was stealing. Every day, he'd come out pushing this wheelbarrow, and they'd search the wheelbarrow, and they never could find anything. And finally, it came time for him to retire, and they asked him, he said, look, he says, I know you've put it over on me for all these years, and I know you've been stealing something. I just don't know what it is. Now, it's too late for me to fire you or do anything. I'd just like to know. The guy said, I was stealing wheelbarrows. Stealing wheelbarrows. Well, God doesn't want us to steal wheelbarrows or anything else. He wants us to realize that we're to be faithful. We're to do it the way that God would have us do it. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 1 says, let as many servants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, that the name of God and His doctrine be not blasphemed. They that have believing masters, let them not despise them because they're brethren, but rather do them service because they're faithful and beloved, partakers of the benefit. These things teach and exhort. Sometimes there have been people who work for someone else in the church, and they sort of figured that they could kind of slough off. They didn't have to really do all that much because they figure, he's in the church, he'll understand. And they expected special favors. Well, God says, it ought to be the very opposite. We ought to work hard for anybody, and especially even do more if somebody was a member. There's an accountability. The point is, whether you're a boss or an employee, whether you're a master or a servant, you're still accountable. You see, whatever our position, we're accountable. Husbands are accountable. Husbands have rulership in the family over their wife and children, but they're accountable. They're not just on their own, independent, just go and rule their family any way they wish. Because we're told that in Ephesians chapter 5 that in verse 25, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And so we're told here, as we go through Ephesians chapter 5, it's very clear that there's an accountability. God is going to judge those of us who are husbands. We're accountable for how we use our authority in the home. If we're abusive with it, if we're careless with it, if we're indifferent to our family's welfare, if we're selfish with it, ultimately we're going to have to answer to God for that. There's an accountability. And the same thing with wives. It says, wives, verse 22 of Ephesians 5, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. The husband is head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Now, wives ultimately are responsible to God for how they carry out their responsibility. Husbands are accountable to God for how they carry out theirs. Employees, employers, whatever our position, whatever our circumstance in life, whatever area and aspect that God has given us any management over, we are accountable for how we use it. You see, what's required of a good manager is he's got to be faithful and honest. You want him to be wise. You want him to be blameless and above reproach in his conduct. And he has to live with accountability. That he is ready to give an account of his conduct. He's not a law unto himself. Just off sort of doing it however he wants to do it. There is an accountability that we all have in every aspect of our lives. Virtually all of us, and all of us really, are accountable to even to man's government for various aspects of our lives. But ultimately, we're all accountable to God's government. You see, we are accountable if we're a steward, and we never know exactly when God is going to demand an auditing of the books. You know, it says in Matthew chapter 25, Matthew chapter 25 and verse 21, we see the principle here. As Lord said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I'll make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. You know, there's a principle here of, being ready, and that there is an opportunity of great reward for what we do with what we have now. But notice what it says back a few verses earlier in verse 44 of chapter 24. It says, therefore be you also ready, for in such hour as you think not, the Son of Man comes. Who then is a faithful and wise steward, whom his Lord has made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find him so doing. When the time comes that an account of our stewardship is to be called in that sense, an auditing of the books, to use the analogy, he said, blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find him so doing. You know, he's right. He's doing what he ought to do. He's just going right along. It doesn't matter when you stop and audit the books. They're the way they ought to be. Truly, I say, he'll make him ruler over all his goods. But and if that evil servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delays his coming, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken. Oh, so he's not faithful. He's not wise. He's not above reproach. He's not ready to give an account. He says, it's a long time off. I got years left. I don't have to worry about some of this stuff now. I'll get it together before Christ comes back, but that's a long ways off. That's years off, and I'm young and healthy, and I don't have any worries. Sometimes young people think that. They think that they've got just years ahead of them. They don't have to worry about really getting serious about things till they get old. As though somehow there's invulnerability and immortality conveyed on the young. Well, that's not the way it is. We need to number our days to apply our hearts unto wisdom, because none of us knows how many days we have, no matter how young we are, no matter how old we are. None of us has some guarantee of how many days we have. So we're told number our days and apply our hearts unto wisdom. Realize that they are numbered, they are short, they are finite. Our time is finite. And we better make best use of it, because every day that goes by is one day you don't have. So he says, that evil servant says, my Lord delays his coming. That's a long ways off. So he begins to smite his fellow servants. And he begins to eat and drink with the drunken. He gets caught up in this world's lifestyle, out to, boozing it up and whoring around and doing all this sort of thing. Not faithful, not careful in his responsibilities. Not conducting himself as though he's ready to be audited at any moment. But he figures, I'll have plenty of time. Well, the Lord of that servant is going to come in a day when he looks not for him, and in an hour that he's not aware of, and shall cut him asunder and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. He'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's going to be too late then. The point is that we're all managers and we're stewards. It is not required that we be a perfect manager. God didn't say, if you are a perfect manager and if you do everything perfectly. He said it is required in a steward that he be found faithful. See, that's what God requires, is not that we have perfectly, we're totally perfect at everything, but he does require that we're found faithful. He requires that we're faithful, that our heart is in it, that we are striving and seeking to do it, that we're faithful. And that we're trying to grow in faithfulness and in wisdom, in being blameless, that we are trying to be ready to give an account of realizing that at any time, because our time is finite, it's limited. We're going through a training ground to prepare us for managing the universe on into eternity. Managing the earth for the world tomorrow and the universe on into eternity as a part of the very family of God. We need to be about our Father's business. Learning to be profitable servants. Learning to be wise and faithful stewards, whom our Lord shall give rulership over all things at his return.